Real nightmares.
The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that made Officer Tom Weaver uneasy. The small town he patrolled hadn't seen much crime in years, yet something in the air felt wrong. As he drove along the empty streets, his headlights barely cut through the thick fog that clung to the roads. He had done this route countless times, but tonight, something nagged at him. Weaver slowed his cruiser near an old streetlight that flickered erratically. There, under the faint glow, a shadowy figure stood motionless. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a person just out for a walk. But the figure didn't move. Something about the way it stood, unnaturally still, sent a chill down his spine. Gripping the wheel, Weaver's instincts kicked in. He pulled over, stepping out of the car. "Hey," he called out, but there was no response. As he approached, his boots crunching on the gravel, the figure seemed to melt into the shadows, vanishing completely. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty spot where the figure had been. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive. Weaver shook his head, brushing it off as nothing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Weaver tried to dismiss the incident from his mind, but it clung to him like the fog that settled over the town. During his next shift, as he made his usual rounds, his eyes were constantly scanning the streets, searching for that dark figure. He told himself it had been his imagination, just a trick of the light or fatigue from long hours. But then, he saw it again. This time, the figure stood further down a dimly lit alley, its form barely visible, but unmistakably there. Weaver's heart raced. He stopped the cruiser and stepped out, only to be met with the same oppressive silence. As he approached, a faint whisper floated on the cold night air. His name. Tom. He froze, fear surging through him. Spinning around, he found the alley empty. The figure had vanished again. But the whispered voice lingered in his mind, unmistakable and terrifying. That whisper echoed in Weaver's head, haunting him long after his shift ended. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With a sinking heart, he decided to revisit a part of his past he had worked so hard to forget. Digging through old police files, he found what he was looking for. The protest from years ago, when everything had gone wrong. There it was, his name tied to the shooting of an unarmed man. Weaver stared at the report, his hands shaking. The man's face, the same one he had tried to bury in the back of his mind, resurfaced. His name was Daniel Harper. Hoping to quiet the growing dread, Weaver visited Harper's family. Their faces were hard, unforgiving. "You know what you did," Harper's mother said, her voice cold. Weaver left, feeling more alone than ever. The figure wasn't just a trick. It was something far worse. Chapter 4. The Watcher revealed 200 words. The fog was thicker than usual that night, swallowing the town in a cold, impenetrable veil. Weaver drove slowly, his hands gripping the wheel, heart pounding. He had seen the figure again, standing near an abandoned house at the edge of town, but this time, he knew he couldn't ignore it. It was pulling him in. Weaver parked his cruiser and stepped out, breath visible in the chill air. As he walked closer, the figure remained, unmoving. His pulse raced. "Show yourself," he shouted, voice breaking the night's silence. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. Weaver's blood turned to ice. The man's face was unmistakable. It was Daniel Harper. "You've been hiding," the ghostly figure said, its voice low, accusatory. Weaver backed away, terror filling every inch of him. "You thought you could forget. You thought no one was watching." Weaver shook his head, stumbling backward. I didn't mean to." But the ghost's cold eyes stared through him. "I've been watching you for years," Harper whispered, "waiting. It's time for the truth to come out." Weaver's guilt hit him full force, suffocating him as the ghost stepped closer. There was no escape now. He was being judged for his sins. Weaver's legs gave out, and he fell to his knees on the cold ground, breath ragged. The ghost stood over him, silent now, but its presence felt suffocating. Every memory of that night, the gunshot, Harper falling to the ground, the cover-up that followed, flooded his mind, each one sharper than the last. "I didn't mean to kill you," Weaver gasped, his voice trembling. "It was a mistake. I was scared. I didn't." The ghost's eyes never wavered, cold and accusing. Weaver broke down, sobbing, the weight of years of guilt finally overwhelming him. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, without a word, the figure of Harper began to fade into the mist. Weaver was left alone, his body shaking uncontrollably. Though the ghost had vanished, the guilt still clung to him, heavier than ever. Days later, Weaver sat in his car, staring blankly through the windshield. His confession to the department had opened an investigation. The town buzzed with rumors, and his colleagues avoided him. The isolation felt suffocating, but even worse was the relentless sense of being watched. That night, as he drove through the fog-covered streets one last time before his leave, Weaver glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, in the back seat, sat the dark figure of Daniel Harper, his eyes fixed on Weaver. Silent, unmoving. Weaver's heart raced, cold sweat trickling down his neck. He swerved the car, pulling to the side of the road, but when he turned around, the back seat was empty. Breathing heavily, he sat there for a long moment. He realized with a sinking dread that Harper would never truly leave him. No matter what Weaver did, the past would always follow. Detective Sarah Tate crouched beside the dusty, forgotten crime scene. The room was cold, abandoned years ago, but the bloodstains on the floor still carried a sense of violence. The unsolved murder of a woman, Jane Morrison, had haunted the precinct for over a decade. It had been relegated to the cold case files, another forgotten soul. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. Unknown number. Frowning, Sarah answered. "Hello?" A faint, trembling voice replied. "Help me. Please find him. You have to stop him." Sarah stood up, her pulse quickening. "Who is this?" "My name is Jane Morrison," the voice said, a touch of desperation in every syllable. "He killed me. You have to stop him." Sarah's throat tightened. It couldn't be possible. Morrison had been dead for years. "This isn't funny. I'm not a joke. Find him, before it's too late." The line went dead. Sarah stood in the empty room, the faint echo of the voice still lingering in her mind. Jane Morrison. That voice had sounded so real, so desperate. Shaking her head, Sarah pulled out the old case file from her bag. Morrison had been killed 13 years ago, her body found in this very room. The case had gone cold after months of dead ends, with no suspects ever brought in. She thumbed through the pages, scanning for something, anything she might have missed. The eerie details of the crime played in her head. No signs of forced entry, no defensive wounds, just a brutal, calculated murder. Nothing had ever made sense. Then she saw it. A detail she hadn't focused on before, now strangely relevant after the call. The victim had made a phone call just minutes before her death, though it had never been traced. Her skin prickled as the room felt suddenly colder, the air heavier. A whisper seemed to drift through the silence. "Find him." Sarah sat at her desk, the cold case file spread in front of her. She couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest since that night. It wasn't possible, she knew that. Dead women didn't make phone calls. Still, there was something she couldn't ignore. The call had sparked a nagging itch in the back of her mind, one she couldn't scratch away. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the phone to her ear. "Hello?" This time, the voice was different, angrier, panicked. "I don't have much time. He's coming. Please, help me. Don't let him do it again." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" "Emma Hall. He killed me." The woman's voice cracked with desperation. "You need to stop him." Sarah's breath hitched. Emma Hall, another unsolved murder from years ago. She could hear whispers now, faint, just beyond her understanding. And then, silence. The phone slipped from her hand. Her heart pounded as shadowy shapes seemed to flicker at the edges of her vision, just out of reach. The phone calls had become a haunting rhythm in Sarah's life, each one pulling her deeper into the past. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think of anything but the voices. Morrison, Hall. They were all tied to unsolved cases, and each had left her with a chilling sense of dread. One night, her phone rang again. She hesitated, staring at the screen. The familiar unknown number glowed, but something in her gut twisted. She answered. Sarah. Her stomach lurched at the sound of the voice. It wasn't the usual plea from a stranger. It was different, familiar. Too familiar. Sarah, you have to find me. Her breath caught in her throat. Who is this? It's me. Megan. The world seemed to spin beneath her. Megan, her best friend from childhood. She had vanished without a trace 15 years ago, leaving Sarah haunted by guilt and helplessness. The voice continued, softer now, as if speaking from somewhere far away. You never looked hard enough, Sarah. He's still out there. Please find him. Sarah's hand trembled, the phone feeling impossibly heavy in her grasp. The guilt she had buried for so long surged back, crushing her. The line went dead, and Sarah was left alone, shaken by the realization that her past was not as buried as she had thought. Sarah was unraveling. The calls consumed her, clawing at her every waking thought. Her partner, Marcus, had started noticing the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands would tremble, the distracted looks she gave during briefings. He'd even asked her if she was okay, but she brushed it off, focusing only on the voices, the cases, the overwhelming guilt. Megan's call had shattered something inside her. She couldn't stop thinking about her friend's disappearance, how she had searched for days and weeks but eventually gave up when the leads dried up. But now the voice insisted that Megan's killer was still out there, and Sarah couldn't escape the possibility that she had missed something. She spent every night poring over the cold case files, looking for a connection. Shadows crept along her apartment walls, flickering in her peripheral vision. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Sometimes she wouldn't answer, but the voices would bleed through the silence, whispering her name. Sarah, you didn't try hard enough. You didn't find me. She felt haunted by their presence, by the mistakes she'd made. The victims crowded her mind, their voices desperate, and Megan's face was now everywhere, reflected in mirrors, in windows, always watching her with hollow eyes. Sarah knew she was close to something. The missing link, the one mistake the killer had made, was just out of reach. She could feel it, but as her obsession grew, so did the distance between her and the real world. She was losing herself. Sarah's mind raced as she sifted through the evidence, the pieces finally coming together. She had found a pattern, a string of unsolved cases stretching back decades, all connected by subtle details missed in the initial investigations. And at the center of it all was a name that sent a chill down her spine. Someone close. Someone she trusted. Marcus. The realization struck her like a blow to the chest. He had been involved in all the cases she'd reopened, always present but never under suspicion. The betrayal clawed at her insides, but the phone call from Megan echoed in her mind, her voice begging Sarah to find the truth. Confronting him felt inevitable. That night, she tracked Marcus to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. An eerily familiar place, one connected to Megan's disappearance. The air was heavy with silence as Sarah stepped inside, her gun drawn, her heart pounding. Marcus, she called, her voice trembling with equal parts fury and fear. He stepped out of the shadows, calm, as though he had expected her. I was wondering when you'd figure it out, he said, his smile unnerving. You've been talking to ghosts, Sarah, but they can't help you now. Her hand shook as she raised her gun, but Marcus's words gnawed at her, and the presence of the spirits, the whispers, the faces, closed in around her. The air grew thick, and Megan's voice was louder than ever, crying for justice. You let me die, Sarah, her voice wailed, almost drowning out Marcus's laughter. Sarah squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the warehouse, deafening in the empty space. Marcus crumpled to the floor, his twisted smile fading into the cold stillness. Sarah stood frozen, her breath shallow and ragged, staring at what she had done. Her hands trembled, the gun heavy in her grip, but there was no relief, no sense of victory. The whispers didn't stop. Megan's voice still clung to the air around her, softer now, like a distant echo. You found him, Sarah, but it's too late. It's always been too late. The other voices followed, Jane, Emma, the countless others whose pleas had led her here. Their faces flickered in the corners of the room, faint apparitions that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. And with them, the crushing weight of guilt remained, pressing down on her like a vice. Sarah holstered her gun and stumbled out of the warehouse, her mind numb. She had solved the cases, brought justice to the victims, but their voices still clung to her, trailing behind her like ghosts that would never leave. Back in her apartment, the silence was suffocating. She collapsed into a chair, staring blankly at the empty room. She had done what they'd asked. She had found the killer. But her phone rang. The sound pierced the quiet, sharp and relentless. Her chest tightened. She didn't want to answer, but the ringing continued, insistent and unnerving. It echoed through her mind, louder with each passing second. She reached for it, her hand trembling as she hesitated. And then, in the stillness, she picked up. The dark streets stretched before Officer Sarah Miller like a void. She drove slowly, the hum of her patrol car the only sound in the dead of night. It was the graveyard shift, and nothing ever happened in this town after midnight. The quiet was almost oppressive, pushing the weight of her past to the forefront of her mind. The night her partner died, a night she couldn't forget. The radio crackled suddenly, startling her. "Help, please, someone, help me." A woman's voice broke through the static, weak and desperate. Sarah's hands tensed on the wheel. The voice was barely audible, distorted. She grabbed the radio, her heartbeat quickening. "This is Officer Miller. What's your location?" The response was garbled, but the woman repeated the address. Sarah paused. She knew every street in this town, but that address didn't exist. "Dispatch, can you trace that call?" Only silence greeted her. Sarah hesitated, but turned the wheel, her curiosity and sense of duty pulling her toward the unfamiliar address. As she drove, the familiar streets began to change. The houses became older, the sidewalks cracked and overgrown with weeds. It felt as though she had crossed into a part of town that time had abandoned. She slowed to a stop when the address came into view, or what should have been the address. Instead of a house, she found a row of decaying buildings, their windows boarded up, their structures crumbling. The air around her felt colder, heavy with an unsettling stillness. Sarah radioed in again. "Dispatch, this is Miller. I'm at the given address. Nothing here but an abandoned block. Do you copy?" Only static. Her radio buzzed again, the same voice whispering, "Help me, please." A chill ran down her spine as she stepped out of the car. Sarah's breath hitched as she stood in the eerie stillness, her flashlight cutting through the heavy air. Every shadow seemed alive, and the silence pressed against her like an invisible force. She moved cautiously, boots crunching over broken glass and debris. The buildings loomed over her like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the faintest whisper drifted past her ear. "Please, help me." It was the same voice, but now it felt closer, more intimate, like the woman was just beyond the next corner. Sarah gripped her flashlight tighter, her pulse quickening. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness. There was nothing. The radio on her shoulder crackled to life again, this time louder. The woman's plea returned, but this time, it was warped, distorted, almost inhuman. "Why didn't you help?" Sarah froze, her stomach twisting in knots. It wasn't just the woman's voice anymore. Beneath the static, she could swear she heard another, more familiar voice. Her partner's last words, echoing from the night he died. "John," she whispered into the cold. The radio fell silent again, leaving her standing alone, haunted by the ghost of her past. Sarah backed up, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still there, watching. Shaken, Sarah returned to the station, the sense of dread clinging to her like fog. She couldn't explain what had happened, but the voice on the radio echoed in her mind. "Why didn't you help?" She slumped into her chair, her hands trembling as she began searching through old case files. There had to be something, anything, that would explain the strange neighborhood and the voices. Hours passed, but nothing seemed to make sense. Then, deep in the archives, She stumbled upon reports from officers who had heard similar calls for help. The details were unsettlingly familiar. Distorted voices, untraceable locations, and officers who either disappeared or resigned shortly after their investigations. One report, dated decades ago, made her blood run cold. It detailed an officer who had experienced the same haunting radio call. His final note read, "The voices never stop." He disappeared 2 days later. Sarah's heart raced as she scanned the files. This wasn't just a coincidence. The calls were real, and they had been tormenting officers for years. She stared at the report, feeling a connection between these lost officers and herself. The woman's voice wasn't just another call for help. It was something far darker, and it knew too much about her. Determined to find answers, Sarah returned to the abandoned neighborhood. The streets were even darker now, the shadows longer and more oppressive. Her heart pounded as she stepped out of her cruiser, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. As she ventured deeper, the world around her seemed to shift. The buildings leaned closer, their structures twisting unnaturally. Sarah's radio buzzed with static, and then the voice returned. "Why didn't you help?" She froze. The voice wasn't just the woman's this time. It was her partner's, John's, from that terrible night. His final plea echoed through the static, pulling her back into her worst memory. "John?" Her voice cracked as she whispered his name. The street ahead warped, distorting into the exact alley where John had died. She saw him now, standing at the end of the alley, his figure flickering like a ghost, his eyes hollow. "You left me," John's voice rasped. "You didn't save me." Sarah's heart ached with guilt. I tried," she whispered. The shadows closed in, John's figure growing more monstrous, more distorted. The woman's voice intertwined with his, a terrifying chorus of accusation. Sarah's legs moved before her mind could react. She ran, desperate to escape the voices that clawed at her soul. Sarah escaped the twisted neighborhood, but something inside her felt irreparably broken. The voices had stopped for now, but their weight lingered, an ever-present shadow in her mind. She returned to her routine, patrolling the familiar streets, but nothing felt right anymore. Every night, she braced herself for the inevitable. As her cruiser rolled through the darkened streets, the radio crackled faintly. She gripped the wheel tighter, her pulse quickening. A woman's voice whispered through the static, soft but unmistakable. "Help me?" Sarah's breath caught. The radio remained on, and she could no longer turn it off. Detective Ethan Cole sat in the dimly lit archive room, flipping through faded case files that had long been forgotten. Dust danced in the thin beam of light from the desk lamp as he idly turned the pages of another cold case, his mind elsewhere. It had been 2 years since the accident that took his son, yet the pain clung to him like a shadow. Then, something caught his eye. A case file, dated from 20 years ago, nearly hidden beneath a stack of old papers. He pulled it out and froze. The photo of a boy, no older than 10, stared up at him, hauntingly familiar. The resemblance to his late son was chilling. Ethan's heart raced as he skimmed the report. Brutal murders, all unsolved, with the killings stopping abruptly. His gut instinct told him to walk away, but he couldn't. The past, it seemed, had resurfaced. Ethan couldn't let it go. He reopened the case despite his colleagues' murmurs about it being a waste of time. Visiting the crime scenes, now overgrown and forgotten, he felt a strange pull, as if the air itself held whispers of the past. The families of the victims were reluctant to talk, their eyes darting away whenever Ethan pressed for details. It was as if the entire town had silently agreed to bury the truth. One evening, while examining an old playground where one of the boys was last seen, Ethan caught a glimpse of a figure, a boy standing in the distance, watching him. But as he blinked, the figure vanished, leaving only an unsettling chill. Back at home, Ethan stared at his son's picture on the mantel. He could feel something creeping in, a connection forming between his son's death and these old murders, and it terrified him. The nightmares started soon after. Ethan would wake in a cold sweat, hearing his son's voice calling for him, only to be met with silence in the darkness. During the day, things grew worse. Anonymous phone calls interrupted his work, each one repeating the same phrase, You forgot. At first, he thought it was a cruel prank, but when the calls followed him home, his doubt turned to dread. Then came the night his estranged wife called him, her voice shaking. She and their daughter had received letters, each containing a photograph of their family with the boy's face scratched out. She blamed him, accusing him of bringing whatever this was into their lives. Ethan's grip on the case tightened. The more he tried to bury the trauma of his son's death, the more the past bled into his present. Whatever had started, it wouldn't stop until the truth was uncovered. Determined to put an end to the nightmare, Ethan dug deeper into the case, sifting through old police records. What he uncovered chilled him to the core. Decades ago, his own father, then a respected officer in the same town, had been involved in a cover-up. A young boy named David had been murdered, but the police had framed a drifter for the crime to protect the real killer, the son of a prominent local family. As Ethan pieced the truth together, the eerie occurrences intensified. He began seeing David's face everywhere, in mirrors, in crowds, in the shadows of his own home. The boy's ghost wasn't seeking simple justice. It wanted retribution, and Ethan, tied by blood to those who had buried the truth, had become the target. The revelation tore at Ethan's already fragile mind. His father, now dead, had never spoken of the crime. Ethan wondered how much of his life had been built on a lie, on the suffering of an innocent child. Worse, the spirit of David seemed to be using his son's death as a way to draw him into the nightmare, exploiting his guilt, feeding off his pain. David wasn't just haunting the town. He was haunting Ethan's soul. His nightmare culminated in a single, undeniable pull toward the old lighthouse on the town's edge, a place where Ethan now knew David had been murdered all those years ago. The wind howled as Ethan stood before the crumbling structure, its decaying walls looming in the mist. He entered, flashlight trembling in his hand, stepping into the past. Inside, the temperature dropped. His breath fogged as he saw the faint outline of David's figure, standing in the corner. The boy's hollow eyes locked onto Ethan, the words ringing in the air, "You forgot." Ethan felt the weight of his father's sins crushing him. He had spent his life trying to uphold the law, yet the legacy he inherited was built on injustice. The ghost's presence pressed in, demanding the impossible, atonement for what could never be undone. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, falling to his knees. He knew there was only one way to end this. Offering his life, his guilt, he pleaded for David to release his family from the curse. A cold hand touched his shoulder, and in that moment, Ethan understood that the price for peace was his own sacrifice. As his vision faded, he thought he saw his son smiling, just beyond the mist. The lighthouse was silent, save for the gentle whisper of the wind through its broken windows. Ethan's body was found the next morning, lying cold at the foot of the tower. His death was ruled a heart attack, but those who knew him suspected the weight of his past had finally caught up. His wife and daughter, though devastated, no longer experienced the supernatural torment that had plagued them. The house was quiet again, free from the haunting that had once permeated every corner. Months later, a young rookie officer at the station, eager to prove himself, stumbled upon Ethan's old notebook. Flipping through its pages, he found strange notes about the unsolved murders and mentions of a boy named David. At the end, a scrawled warning: "The past never stays buried." Just as he closed the book, the phone rang. Hesitantly, the rookie picked it up. "You forgot," a voice whispered.